to the subject of facade in honor of Professor Randall Corman's retirement. And so, with that, we remember Professor Corman's lecture a few weeks ago to kick us off. It was a wonderful night, and I'm sure tonight will follow. So, Professor Corman, welcome to tonight's lecture, Charles Burroughs. Thank you.
Can you all hear me back there? Oh, yeah, good. Now you can. Well, it is my great pleasure to be able to introduce our lecturer tonight. Professor Charles Burroughs is our second speaker in the Facade lecture series. I have known of Professor Burroughs' work for a number of years, since fortuitously coming across his excellent book entitled The Italian Renaissance Palace Facade, Structures of Authority and Surfaces of Sense. It was the surfaces of sense part of the title that got my attention. And I think if you attended my presentation a couple of weeks ago, you may recall that out of all the possible books you might read to initiate your investigation into the vertical surface, there were just 4 that I recommended, one of which was Professor Burroughs' book on the Italian Renaissance facade. It's an excellent book. It's an excellent place to begin. I have, for a long time, wanted to bring Professor Burroughs to Syracuse. He was recommended to me many years ago by a colleague at Cornell, and I'm very pleased that we have this opportunity to extend the invitation this time. Professor Burroughs hails originally from Great Britain, where he received his baccalaureate degree from Oxford University and his master's and PhD degrees from the renowned Warburg Institute. If for some reason you're not familiar with the Warburg Institute, it is one of the premier interdisciplinary research institutes in the world. Some of the well-known scholars that have worked and studied there include, among many others, Ernst Gombrich, Erwin Panofsky, Rudolf Witkover, and Colin Rowe. In 1979, Professor Burroughs moved to the U.S. to take up various teaching positions that included stints at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, and the University of California at Berkeley. During the summer of 1982, he taught at the Trinity College summer program at their Rome, Italy campus. In 1982, Professor Burroughs joined the Faculty of Art History at the State University of New York in Binghamton, where between 2004 and 2005 he served as the chair of the Department of Art History. In 2005, he moved to Cleveland, Ohio to take up a position as chair of the Department of Art History and Art at Case Western Reserve University. He remained there as the LCB Smith Professor of Liberal Arts until his retirement in 2014. Fortuitously, he moved to the East. He currently lives in Rochester, New York, and continues to teach at SUNY Geneseo, where he is a visiting professor of art history. He is the author of 3 books and numerous articles and conference papers. His scholarly interests range widely and encompass the Italian architecture and urbanism of the 14th and 17th centuries, Renaissance painting, art writing, plantation landscapes in the Americas, including the Hudson River Valley. Since settling in Rochester, he has been working on a revisionist account of Frederick Law Olmsted's plans for the park system. I'm looking at Julia because she's a landscape architect. And on the impact of Jane Jacobs' ideas about city life on the design by an associate of hers of an academic facility in upstate New York, a building that marked an early departure from modernist orthodoxy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Charles Burroughs. I'm going to give you this, Charles. This is your...
Oh, I have one?
You got
I have
one?
this, I have one, yes.
It's plugged in. Okay, good.
Yeah, we're all plugged in.
And it sounds like your microphone is on.
My microphone is on, yes.
Let me turn mine off here. Let's see.
No, that I don't need.
Stage is yours. And the lights.
Oh, we don't need that yet.
yellow light. Somebody turn the lights off here.
Three.
No, I don't even see the,
No, it's back here.
it should be up here.
Oh,
That's it.
how many
Where's the
people
lights?
does it take? Yes.
Just gonna get on the other side of it.
There you should be on. You want two. Is that good for you?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, this only builds up the suspense, you know. I'd like to thank Randall Coleman for the invitation. It's lovely to be here again. I'd like to thank, well, actually, not only for the invitation, but also for pushing my book, which I'm very happy to hear. Also for all of you for showing up. Facade is something I've been involved with all my life, all my career, but of course this invitation forced me to come back to ideas that were lying dormant, I guess, somewhere down in the bottom of my unconscious. All right, more suspense. Okay.
There may be some feedback. This one's still on.
All right. So I should also say that I'm recovering from a rather horrible attack of whooping cough, which is something I thought only 6-year-olds suffered from. And it really affected my lungs, and I tend to speak these days with a sort of weird whisper. So please, if you can't hear, wave your arms or do whatever is customary here to get the attention of a speaker. Okay, so in my work on the facade, I've always been two major basic themes. First, the facade has a history, a beginning and an end, and possibly new beginnings, which I guess you hear about in this series, which actually I will say I'm very honored to be part of, not least to celebrate this momentous occasion, the retirement of your dean. I must say retirement is a condition I recommend to everybody. Both beginnings and endings, needless to say, happen over many years, and they're very complex events. This complexity is related to my other principle, that the facade is not only an architectural device, but also a cultural phenomenon. It's a matter of the way people think and how they engage with their surroundings. When dealing with many cultural phenomena, it is often useful to start at the end, to carry out a biopsy rather than an interrogation. And that's sort of how we're going to proceed today. But first, I imagine you expect a definition from me. What do I mean by the facade? I should specify right away that my topic is the secular facade, especially the front of a residence or an official building. Religious architecture follows its own logic to a great extent. Also, I will focus on developments in the West, which have distinctive character, though of course they were widely exported, along with the underlying cultural expectations. A common and basically correct definition of the architectural facade is that it is a surface belonging both to the inside and the outside and mediating between them. So it's part of the domestic environment as well as a public space, especially certain types of public space, the street or the square, that loom large in the history of urbanism. On the screen is a representation, an engraving of a famous early 16th century palace in Rome that only existed a few years as a physical building, but enjoyed an extraordinary afterlife as a model for designers. It's the Palazzo Caprini, often known as the House of Raphael, because the famous painter, occasional architect, and papal favorite owned it until his death in an upstairs room in 1520, it's the room on the left, on the top. The architect was Raphael's compatriot, Donato Bramante. They were both from Urbino, who was also trained as a painter, a maker of images. So it's appropriate that in this engraving, the harmoniously composed front of the Palazzo Caprini should float free of the materiality of the built palace. An issue I can't take up here is the coincidence between the emergence of the architectural facade and the diffusion of printing, followed shortly by the appearance of the architectural frontispiece, a kind of facade to a book. As for the idea of a facade as a kind of membrane between inside and outside, this example poses a problem. The print does not indicate the location of the palace, which stood on a busy street. This is the area here. On a busy street, the processional route towards the papal palace of the Vatican, just up the road. This neighborhood was obliterated by Mussolini, so if you've been to the Vatican, you will know that this is open space. The location on a busy street explains the presence of shops on either side of the portal, so that the outside, in quotes, invades the house and makes it part of the street. And a contrast is set up between the lower story with the shops and the upper story with its tall windows, enabling views of the street and the fluid to and fro of the people on the street. The zone of the shops and public access is distinguished by a rough, apparently unworked stone surface, what is known as rustication. The refined elite character of the upper floor is expressed by paired columns and elegant balustrades. In short, the distinction between inside and outside is inscribed on the facade in a way that draws attention to social as well as architectural stratification. It does this through placing classical columns, symbols of civilization, above rough stone, which alludes to the world of nature. Ironically, this natural effect was entirely fake. The apparent stone here was in fact plaster. And so it was as artificial as anything else in the design, pointing again to the sensibility of a maker of painted illusions, which is how Bramante started his career. The dialectic of art and nature, or we might say nature and culture, was a major theme of early modern architecture, especially facade architecture, into the 18th century. What happened then was the emergence of a radical approach, championing the claims of nature and what was claimed to be natural above those of convention and tradition. You probably all know the famous little hut, the Petit Cabane, on the frontispiece of the second edition of the Abbé Laugier's Essay on Architecture of 1755. This dramatizes the rejection of academic classicism, the pile of ruins on the right, in favor of a building rooted in the earth, as well as in a logic of primitive human development. In its ideal form, the building not only lacks a facade, it lacks walls altogether. The landscape of Laugier's grove is entirely imaginary, of course, but I want to shift the discussion to a very real and very dense forest, 30 miles or so from Paris, to a place called Enenville. There it is up at the top. Tucked away among the trees is an actual little hut, a petit cabane with important cultural connections. It was here that the famous French-Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau lived out his last years in retreat from the sickness of civilization as he saw it. There he is sitting in front, apparently with a pet. This is what it looks like now. As you see, there is nothing like a facade on this modest building, not by chance. In an early essay which won him a prize, which set him on his way, Rousseau wrote, "What happiness would it be for those who live among us if our external appearance were always a true mirror of our hearts. External ornaments are foreign to virtue, which is the strength and activity of the mind. The honest man is an athlete who loves to wrestle stark naked. He scorns all those vile trappings which prevent the exertion of his strength, and were for the most part invented only to conceal some deformity." So you architecture students should have something sweaty and muscular like this in mind. Maybe a little nude wrestling in the studio wouldn't be a bad thing from time to time. You should certainly not think of yourself as something like this. In fact, Rousseau he used to dress like this, but he got rid of his fashionable clothes and took to wearing a peasant tunic, like these real peasants. In this respect, he was, of course, a total fraud, if you like, a blatant example of facadism. In his essay, Rousseau doesn't refer explicitly to architecture, but he gets close in statements like these. Before art had molded our behavior and taught our passions to speak an artificial language, our morals were rude but natural, and the different ways in which we behaved proclaimed at the first glance the difference of our dispositions. He's talking about the time when people lived in little huts, primitive people. Human nature was not at bottom better than now, but men found their security in the ease with which they could see through one another, and this advantage prevented their having many vices. Here comes the kicker. Jealousy, suspicion, fear, coldness, reserve, hate, and fraud lie constantly concealed under that uniform and deceitful veil of politeness. Rousseau's emphasis on sincerity in throwing off the mask of polite convention, the deceitful veil of politeness, as he put it, had an extraordinary resonance lasting until today. In terms of the built environment, the architectural facade was the ultimate deceitful veil of politeness, disguising who knows what nasty and naughty behavior inside, as perhaps at the Place des Victoires in Paris. So Rousseau's ideas helped bring about the rejection of traditional notions of urban, not to speak of urbane architecture. Art, including architecture for Rousseau, was a betrayal of nature. And his ideas certainly resonated. If you go to Emenonville, you can still see Rousseau's tombs on the island of Poplars in a landscape park in the English manner where the philosopher once roamed. However, the body itself was soon moved to the Panthéon in Paris, resting place of the heroes of French culture. A few miles from Emenonville is a place of more conventional forms of reverence. The Royal Abbey of Charlie was one of the great monastic institutions that existed in the environs of medieval Paris. There is not much left now of the medieval abbey, built in a Gothic style, which was abhorrent to the cardinal who controlled it in the mid-16th century. This was Ippolito d'Este, known to you, I'm sure, as the patron of the amazing Villa d'Este at Tivoli, which is what you see here, which he began after returning to Italy. He was a major player at the French court, not least because he was related by marriage to the King of France and by virtue of his status as papal ambassador. He had grand plans for modernizing Charlie. Little was built, but a rather pathetic relic of the cardinal's ambitions is an elaborate gate leading to a rose garden. There it is there, the rose garden behind. And this is the garden looking back at the gate, so it's a lovely place. The designer was Sebastiano Serlio, the Italian architect best known for his serial treatises on various aspects of architecture, especially when collected into a single volume that was one of the great architectural publications of the early modern era, quickly inspiring buildings as far away as Mexico and Ecuador, then part of Peru. Serlio was a key figure in the introduction of Italian Renaissance ideas to France. For instance, in one of his treatises, he illustrates how to give a traditional medieval style building as a Renaissance do-over. As you can see, this is really already facade architecture. I mean, he pretends to, reconstruct the interior. No one's kidded by that. It also, as you can see, this is already facade architecture. It also foreshadows the so-called Great Rebuilding in much of early modern Europe, which scattered symmetrical classical facades across diverse townscapes, often concealing medieval fabric. Whatever the eventual success of Serlio's treatise, the man himself had a frustrating experience in France, where local men in the building trades were happy to oppose this know-it-all Italian intruder. He built very little. Actually, his paltry addition to the monastic complex of Charlie is symptomatic. But his little garden portal is interesting as a kind of distillation of a Renaissance facade into its semiotic essence, a set of signs abstracted from a facade's architectural function. Serlio's portal features a grand rusticated archway surmounted by a great pediment and a high attic carrying the arms of the d'Este family. Which are there. The effect is one of collage, an unsatisfactory cobbling together of bits and pieces. In fact, Serlio doesn't like it either, because he left it out of one of his more remarkable publications, The Extraordinary Book, which came out in 1551 in Lyon, in both French and Italian versions. And it is extraordinary. It contains 50 examples of more or less bizarre portal designs, some for urban sites, some rural, and some explicitly recalling the theme of the Roman triumphal arch, a key site of diverse lexical and visual signs, as illustrated by Serlio himself in a section on triumphal arches in his third book. His various books came out at different times. So you can see the basic arch, and the inscriptions are up here. And of course, he included one in the famous tragic scene on a street of palace facades, not unlike the site of the Palazzo Caprini. As you probably know, this was Serlio's illustration of one of Vitruvius's sets for different kinds of drama. Another is a satiric scene, where a forest is organized as a kind of green architecture, prominently containing a little hut. Implicit in this image are themes developed in the Extraordinary Book. The Extraordinary Book opens with the entrance portal of the residence Serlio designed for Ippolito d'Este in Fontainebleau, near the royal palace, which was a major center of the French court and famously important in the diffusion of Italian artistic models in the early 16th century. So this portal functioned as the threshold into a building and also as a threshold into a printed book. Ippolito's residence was known as the Grand Ferrare. The d'Este were lords of Ferrara. All that remains today is the portal. The palace followed the type of the French hotel, in which the main range is located at the rear of an entry courtyard, flanked by subsidiary buildings. The key point is that there's no real street facade in the Italian manner, so the portal assumes particular importance. Serlio's design displays the tension or even conflict of architectural elements and rough stone, in short, art and nature, that he expresses more explicitly elsewhere in the Extraordinary Book, which features all kinds of collisions between elements representing the classical orders and rough or rusticated stone. You may know the extreme example, his illustration of what he calls the bestial order. It's not Doric, it's not even Tuscan, it's bestial. Here, monstrous faces glower from the spandrel stones as if they are knit products of nature's own aberrant form-making. The bestial portal echoes the darkest preoccupations of the period, the rebellion of the repressed. Just think of the Room of the Giants in Mantua, the Giulio Romano, of course, or the facade of the Palazzo degli Ominoni in Milan. Both these examples are associated with imperial power, as well as with the struggle against rampant heresy. As the Grand Ferrare illustrates, the portal can become detached from the building it gives access to. In other words, the architectural task of designing a coherent facade and ever designing a threshold becomes separated. This happens implicitly also in Renaissance Italian facade design. Probably you all know the Palazzo della Cancelleria, built a few years before Bramante's Palazzo Caprini. You can probably see that this actually claims Bramante as the architect. He did work on it, but he certainly wasn't the architect. The impressive width of the chief facade accommodates two major elements, a palace and a major church. Where, may you ask, is the church? As you see, there are two portals, one grander than the other. Is that a clue? In fact, yes. But the grander portal leads to the palace, not the church. So this is the one that leads to the palace, that one to the church. Originally, however, the two portals were identical, elements of a typical unified Renaissance facade. As for example, in Alberti's Palazzo Rucellai in Florence, which ended up with two portals. and is an obvious model for the Cancelleria front, which is 30 or 40 years later. At the Cancelleria, it is only beyond the doors that key differences become apparent. As you can see from the plan, the support, there's the church here on the right, the supports of the church, the piers of the church are probably built of brick. They're square piers built of brick. The supports in the palace courtyard, on the other hand, are columns, apparently of expensive stone. In fact, they were robbed from the ancient building. Oh, here we go. So that's the interior of the church with the piers, the courtyard of the palace with the columns. In fact, these columns were robbed from the ancient building that once stood on the site. Actually, they were robbed twice. Once for the early Christian church, and then in the Renaissance taken from the church and reused in the palace courtyard. It's evidence of changing values, that's for sure. In the 1580s, the decision was taken to disturb the Renaissance effect of balance and harmony by emphasizing the palace entrance, with a splendid two-story portal, including a balcony carrying the emblems of Sixtus V, Pope Sixtus V. Here. Such a balcony became a feature of Roman late Renaissance and Baroque palace design. This is a 17th century view of the Quirinal Hill, dominated by an immense palace, once a favorite papal residence, now the official home of the President of Italy. The main entrance looks out onto the Piazza of Montecavallo, with its famous ancient statues of horse tamers, symbols of autocratic power. The portal itself was largely designed by Medano around 1615. It opens in a vast wing of the palace, and its design and location have nothing to do with any concern to make a facade responding to Renaissance design principles, balance, harmony, symmetry, etc. Indeed, this is as autonomous a portal as any of Serlio's. The presence of the portal gives the presence of a balcony gives the entrance portal a double function, both as a threshold here and as a viewing platform here for the grand personage, a resident in the palace. Whether or not it is actually occupied, the balcony is a symbol of power, and so is often present in a facade. And nowadays, of course, the national flag is placed on the balcony in place of the president. An interesting example of such a portal brings us back to the Cancelleria and the function of the ancient building that provided the courtyard columns. It was a barracks for one of the 4 chariot racing teams the Romans flocked to see in the Circus Maximus, which was, along with the Colosseum, one of the greatest sporting facilities of the ancient world. Unlike the Colosseum, it was overlooked by and connected to the imperial palaces on the Palatine Hill, which you see here. A favorite occupation of Renaissance antiquarians was recreating social practices of the Romans, including their recreations. I'll show you a very fanciful recreation of the circus. It's from a famous late 16th century atlas of prints that exists in various versions. The horses and chariots are tearing around the course, cheered on by the crowd, including dignitaries assembled in a viewing stand raised above an archway. It's a rusticated archway, as you can see. Evidently, this is the imperial box, located on the side towards the palace complex on the Palatine Hill. As was well known in Renaissance Rome, there was such a viewing loggia, a catisma, in the Hippodrome of Constantinople. It's over here, in the palaces. It's shown on this 5th century relief, which is still in the Hippodrome in contemporary Istanbul. And this is a reconstruction of the emperor's view of the Hippodrome. An echo of the Byzantine Katisma exists in Isfahan in Iran, in the great viewing platform, part of the late 16th century Ali Kapur Palace that overlooks the Maidan, a vast space used for polo games, horse and camel races, and other spectacles. This is Ali Kapur here. As far as I know, there were no camel races in Renaissance Rome, but there was a fashion for Spanish-style bullfights. A great enthusiast was Pope Paul III, who commissioned Michelangelo in 1546 to work on the great palace he had been building for about 30 years, mostly as cardinal. This was the Palazzo Farnese, where a huge piazza was carved out of the city to set off the palace front. Michelangelo's major contribution to the facade was the design of the balcony, from which the Pope loved to watch bullfights, as well as the processions of carnival, which were rerouted through the piazza. The focus of carnival events was the Via del Corso, which that took the name for the horse races that took place along it from the 15th century. There are the horse races. So at least for a few days a year, the Corso was the modern equivalent of the Circus Maximus. The races went the whole length of the Corso, ending under another balcony inserted into a facade, in this case that of the 15th century Palazzo Venezia, notorious as a favorite place for Mussolini's harangues. You see the Duce in full flow there. The spectacle of the Corso, not only at Carnival, impacted the facade architecture even of a church. This is Santa Maria Inviolata, not far from the Palazzo Venezia, where Pope Alexander VII had a viewing platform built into the front. You could say that the theme of the viewing platform has taken over the whole facade. So far, I've been exploring the tension in early modern facade design between first the aesthetic, as well as rhetorical concern with fronting a building with a unified composition. Second, the social concern of accommodating and dramatizing the active entrance, that is, mediating between different kinds of space, as well as human life worlds. And third, in certain cases, focusing the facade's potential as a viewing platform through a balcony that becomes a major element of its design. I've also noted the way in which facades, Renaissance facades, often emphasize the contrast of rough or rusticated lower stories with colonnaded zones of refinement and control in the story above, the piano nobile, the noble floor. The Palazzo Caprini was, we saw, a key model. Although certainly some 16th century facades lack this contrast, it is a determining feature of an important current of facade design with interesting social or even political overtones. A remarkable case is the Palazzo dei Conservatori on the Campidoglio in Rome, effectively the city hall of the Renaissance city. This is the conservatory here. As you no doubt know, the palace was redesigned by Michelangelo as an element of an urban scenography embracing three buildings arrayed around a piazza that mounded into an oval pavement. At the Palazzo dei Conservatori, Michelangelo accepted and enhanced the traditional inclusion of the offices of craft guilds, butchers, cattle merchants, dealers in spices, etc., in the ground floor loggia. These are the entrances into these offices here. Beneath the magnificent spaces for the city officials on the upper floor. Michelangelo made the contrast visible through associating a small Ionic order in the portico with a colossal Corinthian order embracing both stories. See here or here. This is a pioneer use of a colossal order structuring a facade. Michelangelo's Corinthian order is orthodox, see the detail there, indeed canonical, and surely alludes to the nearby ancient forum, while of course drawing attention to the main function of the building, a seat and symbol of the city government. The Ionic of the portico, on the other hand, is entirely unorthodox, even weird. I've argued elsewhere that the volutes allude to animal hides. In other words, the economic basis of the Roman citizen elite, who were cattle dealers in leather. In any case, these bizarre volutes characterize the basement floor of the palace in a manner more usually assigned to rustication. The realm of nature is inherently fluid, often metamorphic and alive. The rough stone used in rustication is pietra viva, living stone. Even more striking is the contrast of flowing order as substrate to a solid, emphatically architectonic upper structure. The Campidoglio is part of this structure also. Michelangelo largely rebuilt the Palazzo dei Conservatori, but he just refaced the, that's another view of the volutes. He refaced the existing and largely ancient Senator's Palace, the Justice Building, at the head of the piazza, adding the favorite double stair leading up to the entrance. The stair generated triangular spaces on either side of the central niche, which these triangular spaces were filled with ancient statues of river gods, one representing the Tiber and one the Nile, the greatest river of the ancient world, either side of a statue of Roma. And the Tiber rests on a compliant wolf and holds a cornucopia, symbol of natural fertility. Between these images of metaphorical fluidity, Pope Sixtus V had an actual fountain installed in the late 1580s in front of the figure of Rome. You see it there. This set up a telling opposition of a basin overflowing with water, and above it the hieratic personification of empire within a grand classical niche, ruling the waves. This in turn related to the idea already articulated in ancient sources of the city of Rome as raised above a hydrographic stratum comprising 7 streams, the same number as its hills, as well as of the branches of the Nile Delta. Of course, disastrous flooding was common in Rome until the construction of the 19th century embankments along the river. On those occasions, the whole city barely rose above the swirling water. This is a column which shows the height of the water at different times. So I'm going to end with the idea of an opposition of fluid and solid material, or matter, as a recurrent theme of Renaissance and Baroque architecture, especially facade design. The opposition is especially clear, of course, in the design of the monumental fountains that Rome is famous for. The first to be built was Sixtus V's Moses fountain, with its ludicrously bad statue of Moses on the Via Pia, now 20 Settembre. Moses stands triumphant over the streams of water that, according to the Bible, he miraculously caused to flow from solid rock. The type recurs even more dramatically in the fountain of Paul V on the Trastevere, and even in the Trevi fountain, where the water imagery forms the base of a palace facade. A particularly remarkable example is a structure that features what can only be called a succession of facades, if you like, a game of facades, in which the theme of water is expressed in time, that is, the time it takes to move through this complex, rather than in space, the visible area of the main facade. The elaborately planned Villa Giulia at Rome was built for Pope Julius III in the 1550s. The central part of the 3-part main facade is articulated on both floors by a triumphal arch motif emphasizing the main entrance, while the middle section of the arch breaks forward to support a balcony. After all, this is a papal villa. The supporting function of the ground floor is expressed by rustication, notably on the lower arch, indicating the usual hierarchy of stories in an urban residence. This was a suburban villa, but it was in a fairly built-up area close to a major road and the loading station on the Tiber, as well as to the northern edge of the old city. It was very much part of 16th century Rome. The villa itself is made up of successive enclosures, though only the first 2 are readily accessible by a visitor. The second is the famous grotto, sunk below ground level on 2 levels. Michelangelo had a hand in its design, at least as consultant. After passing through the first courtyard and entering a loggia, the visitor immediately sees a tall facade, articulated by triumphal arch motifs in the central axis, while on the top level, this triumphal arch motif gives visual access to an otherwise apparently inaccessible secret garden. In front of the viewer, on either side, a curving stair winds down or invites descent to a lower level, down here, a terrace closed to the rear by a triumphal arch on line with the one above. The terrace opens out to a deep space beneath. This is the grotto proper, in which figures of nymphs pressed into service as caryatids support a semicircular entablature, which transmits the arch motif from the vertical to a horizontal plane, which is also expressed in the floor beneath. There are stairs down to the lowest level, but they are well conceived. Below the nymphs and behind them flows a stream, water from the river Aniene that flows from Tivoli and meets the Tiber not far from here. The middle story of the rear facade of the villa above the nymphs still features niches containing river gods. Personifications of the Aniene and Tiber, the local streams. This correspondences to the Campidoglio are evident, but the important point is the way that the solid, indeed triumphal architecture rises above and from a zone of fluidity and flux, of slippery nymphs who seem far too slender and girly to hold up so great a superstructure. The villa was a retreat for the Pope, certainly. He liked to hang out in a cool vaulted room off the main terrace, drinking wine and eating raw onions. But more importantly, this was, he wanted his privacy. But more importantly, this was an architectural laboratory, originally enriched aesthetically and in semiotic terms by fresco painting, that at least in the grotto area have largely disappeared. The Villa Giulia was designed as a retreat from the Vatican, though it was also used for official functions. But the theme of architecture rising above water in an urban context is obviously a feature of palace architecture in one very special place, the lagoon city of Venice. Here, grand facades rise above the canals, especially the Grand Canal, perhaps the original parade street of Europe. The palace balconies provided splendid views of the regatta and other festive events held on the Grand Canal. One of the most splendid palaces, Sansovino's Palazzo Corner, is a version of the Palazzo Caprini, with a basement floor used for commercial purposes, fronted by rustication, and the upper floors, the aristocratic apartments, adorned with paired columns. I just noticed that the brackets here are striated, as if they're supposed to look like falling water. These are the waterfalls. In other Renaissance palaces on the canal, the water of the canal seems to take the place of rustication. Sebastiano Serlio had spent many years in Venice, and his publications show a deep appreciation of the architecture of the city. Whether or not he was thinking of Venice or Roman villa architecture, when he was working for the Cardinal d'Este and for the French royal court, he produced designs that featured the opposition of fluid and solid. These designs are not for urban palaces or even facades. I'm going to make a quick detour. Consider a design for a bathing pavilion, intended for the pleasure and hopefully also the hygiene of the king and his company. I'll come back to the topic of the facade in due course. In this unexecuted project, for example, the lower floor contains a bathing area around a kind of interior pool. It was there in the section. And above it, there is an airy platform for socializing and enjoying the view. The elevation shows a facade with the main features of the Palazzo Caprini, rustication and a sense of dark enclosure below, and a lighter and better lit upper story with elegant columns. A similar building, in which Serlio seems to have had a hand, is part of the most prominent residential, one of the most prominent residential buildings in Europe, the royal family of Fontainebleau. Here, a long demolished wing contained at the end a grotto, this is the building here, adjoining a garden set with pine trees, the Jardin des Pins. The grotto, therefore, is always known as the Grotte des Pins. It wasn't a bathing pavilion, as was once thought, but it overlooked the long disappeared pools of the Garden of Pines. The front is an orgy of rustication. Human figures struggle as if resisting their transformation into stone and enslavement as support figures in the architecture. Inside, there's a vault with partly excellent painting showing an upper realm of goddesses represented in foreshortening, high over the world of human struggle or pleasure, and accompanied by birds of the air as well as of water. You see the ducks up there. The building was soon well known through prints, one of which represented as having a two-story facade. The grotto's reception was no doubt enhanced by the resonances with Michelangelo's unfinished images of slaves, which also rather later ended up in a grotto. What, you may wonder, does this have to do with facade architecture? To return to the point I made at the beginning, the facade is a matter of consciousness, of habits of thought as much as building. Serlio's little pavilion and the Grotte des Pins, and many other things I might have showed you, bring into the open the conceptual logic of many Renaissance and Baroque designs that dramatize the stance of an aristocratic palace owner toward the public realm, an expression of social security, social superiority. I'm retired, I've got it on the mind. Social superiority. This is not the whole story, though. If you know early modern cityscapes, say in Mantua or Vicenza, you may well marvel at their coherence, the way that buildings of different scale and architectural elaboration contribute to the overall effect. Already Leon Battista Alberti, in the 15th century, obviously implicitly referring to facades, argued the effect of a fine private palace contributes to the beauty of the city as a whole. Unfortunately, it's a principle that doesn't necessarily apply to the towers of the contemporary city. The concluding point I want to make is that the early modern architectural facade was indeed a kind of screen, but it was also a field of resolved or unresolved encounter between opposing principles, often with social overtones. Especially in relation to the design of facades, early modern architects operated on a spectrum between metaphorical fixity and fluidity, not least in terms of norms and rules. Alberti had argued that the place for architectural license was deep within a building or in the country. For city buildings, architects should observe convention and the sense of what was appropriate for the setting as well as the client. This is good advice, needless to say, but at least in many urban modern settings, the facade of a residence is the site of what Serlio might have called licentious design. License is one of his favorite words, whether in built or sculpted elements or in painted imagery. On the other hand, Serlio leaves room for the playful engagement with architectural rules that, in fact, were never absolute in the Renaissance. And as we saw in the extraordinary portals of the extraordinary book, always gave room for inventiveness and fantasy. We are back in the forest in a way, since Serlio justified his departure from orthodoxy in the extraordinary book in his insistence that he was away from civilization in the forested countryside of Fontainebleau, populated by animals or beasts rather than men. I'm sure he was joking. On the other hand, if we actually look at the facades of Renaissance architects, it's hard not to conclude that the forest and the city, the world of nature and that of men, were not so far apart. Thank you.
Do you want to take some questions? Professor Burroughs would be happy to take some questions if there are any.
Depends on the questions. How happy I would be.
Anybody have a question?
Very much enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I had a question about Renaissance theatre and facades for stage sets.
Yes.
To what extent did those push the limits of the playfulness that you talked about, or inventiveness that you talked about? Could you do something with a theatre facade that you couldn't do perhaps with a real built architectural facade?
Yeah, it's an interesting,
Charles,
right?
you might repeat the question so that...
It's a question about the possibility that the design of theatre sets might have had an enlivening effect on architecture. That's certainly true of the 17th century. I think in the 16th century, the theatre was just getting going. I mean, Palladio, as you probably know, designed, at the end of his life, he designed a theatre, a Vitruvian theatre with a stage set, which may have been built after his death. So that's 1580. It's been suggested, I mean, Irving Lavin actually wrote a famous article about the Campidoglio where he suggests that, this is an example of a stage set. if you like, transmitted to real three-dimensional space. And then, of course, even earlier than that, there are the mysterious, the Urbino panel and the Baltimore panel, this famous, perspectival sets or scenes, which we really don't know who did them or when they were done exactly. They're from Urbino, certainly. But the suggestion has been made that these were connected in some way to very early experiments in scenography, if you like, which was, of course, Vitruvius's word scenografia, which is also sort of word for perspective. So perspective and theatre design very much bound up together. So Serlio's designs for theatre sets are in his book on perspective. That's the last lesson on perspective at the end of the book. It says, if you follow the book, this is what you can do with it. So, yeah.
You started out with the statement about the facade being both the inside
Mm-hmm.
and the outside, but I wonder if you could talk more about the functional aspect of the late medieval Renaissance facade as a real barrier, though, because practically in an age of urban unrest, we know the facade was not as open as it appears. There were metal bars, there were big doors, there were street insurrections, there was a defensive quality, and then as the rise of urban institutions developed, you have these enclosures for the poor, for the sick, for the prostitutes, for the criminals, which are, like in Domenico Fontana, the same ones who designed
San Michele.
and the facade on the Cancelleria. I mean, he did all these papal things, but he also did these facades that are essentially barriers.
Yeah.
And there's that contradiction of this theatrical openness and then the practical closure. I wonder if you could just riff on that a little bit.
Well, these were cities that were very violent. I mean, extraordinarily violent places. And you're right, the defensive aspect was important. And, if I'd begun at the beginning, which is really takes us back into perhaps the 14th, 13th centuries, then what you have is entirely a defensive function of these. Although they're also concerned with commerce. That's the interesting thing. Is defense on the one hand, what you're defending on the ground floor are goods. Obviously people are upstairs, but you're making sure that your goods are safe, your treasure is safe, because these guys are merchants. And rustication, the early example of a kind of, as I put it, a very sophisticated rustication is the Medici Palace in Florence, which is deliberately, in some sense, imitating the Palazzo della Signoria, the city hall, city palace, which in turn imitates a feudal palace in a nearby town, where the rustication is clearly used in a defensive way because you can't put a ladder up against it as easy as a flat wall. So that's one of the ways in which rustication comes about. Is that kind of defensive structure?
It seems to be a moment of transition where rustication is a carryover from fortification, and then it gets into the symbolic, natural world, a kind of pre-civilized, the type of foundation for the civilization,
exactly.
the classical orders
Well,
you talked about. So what is that moment, and how does that happen?
That moment, I think, is the Palazzo Medici, which is such a crucially important building. There is a distinction between the basement floor, heavily rusticated, but also connected with commerce, because there was a loggia on the corner, which is later filled in, where the bank was, and upstairs. And what's interesting is the apertures don't line up. The windows don't line up. There is a clear division between the lower level and the upper level. Even though when you go inside, we went inside in the 15th century, some of the rooms on the ground floor were used by the family as summer rooms and so on. So that's where this symbolic resonance, if you like, of rustication seems to become explicit.
And I think in one of your early articles you mentioned, because I remember this, that the cost of the rustication at the Palazzo Medici in Florence was far more
Yes.
than the cost of the fine ashlar
That's right.
construction, so that
Yes.
the pretense of
Yeah.
rustic,
Yes.
natural was actually expensive
Mhm.
artifice, yeah.
It was an expensive piece of architecture.
Like
Yeah.
your old article, your first article,
Oh,
I remember it from a theater.
well, thanks, that's great.
It was very influential, yeah. That's great. Richard?
Yes.
Thank you for talking, it's excellent. The question about the Villa Giulia.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting revelation about, I've always seen the tripartite facade of the Nymphaeum and the Secret Garden as a kind of a reflection
Yes.
of the kind of a Clyde version of the same motif on the front facade.
That's right.
Sort of a reflection in that direction, but the kind of reciprocity between plan and section that you pointed out is kind of fascinating. I'm wondering, I mean, I've always understood that as a kind of intellectual construction of modernism, that plan and section kind of fold. And I'm thinking, is this a singular example, you know, of
Yeah,
the
it's
Renaissance?
an interesting question.
The one thing about Palladio at Malcontento, you have the plate folded down.
Yeah.
I can't think of anything else other than, because this is a fairly sophisticated version of that reflection of the plan and of the same exact arch motif in that elevation. Maybe a capirola, but probably not. I don't know if this is the only example of this.
I think you've got me stumped.
In a
It was-
Rousseau sort of way.
It's a great question. I mean, you had the 18 working in the Villa Giulia. I mean, you had
18,
you had Vignole, Vasari, and you had Michelangelo lurking in there as well. And so they were clearly out to do something really, really very special. But that flipping of the motif, I mean, obviously when Palladio came to Rome, he came in 1556, I think, when the building had just been finished. He obviously looked at it. He would have probably.
that'd be a very, very difficult thing to even detect on site.
Yeah. But the other thing about the triumphal arch motif is that it is the plan of a certain kind of basilica without a transept. I mean, it's already kind of there. So, but
No, it's a fantastic observation.
yeah. No, it always seemed to be an important feature of the palace, but unfortunately, especially confronted with you, I didn't follow it up.
Anybody else? Charles, thank you.
Fantastic.